The auctioneer sprang to the block, and from the darkness at the foot of the steps was hurled a chain leash, and then 2 more. He held them for a moment, and then, keeping them taut, stepped back. He met resistance. Below, in the darkness, there came a sudden, startling, savage report of a slave whip snapped 3 times. Then regally, in black cloaks, with hoods, 3 women, 2 girls and their leader, climbed the stairs to the block, backs straight, heads high, their features concealed in the folds of the hood. Each of them had her wrists braceleted before her body, and each slave chain led to the slave bracelets of one of the girls. The lead girl, probably Elizabeth, was on a somewhat shorter chain than the 2 behind her. 1 on each side, doubtless Virginia and Phyllis. Their black cloaks were rather like ponchos with hoods, save that there were slits through which their arms emerged. The length of the cloak, which was full and flowing, fell to their ankles. Their feet, of course, were bare. They stood near the centre of the block, their leashes in the hands of the auctioneers. "These 3 are barbarians, 2 white silk, 1 red silk," called the auctioneer. "All from the house of Cernus, whom it is our hope you will find pleasing." "Are they trained?" called a voice. "They are so certified," responded the auctioneer. He then summoned 3 whip slaves to the block, and each held a chain of one of the girls. At the auctioneer's commands, the slaves led the girls about the block, and then brought them again to its shining, shallow, concave centre. "What am I offered?" called the auctioneer, and there was silence. "Come now, brothers and sisters of glorious R, citizens and gentle buyers of glorious R, and friends of R and hers, what am I offered for these 3 barbarians?" There was a bid of 3 gold pieces from the auditorium, probably intended to do little more than initiate the bidding. "I hear 3, called the auctioneer. "Do I hear 4? As he said this, he moved to one of the girls and threw back her hood. It was Virginia. Her head was back, and she looked disdainful. She wore the cosmetics of a pleasure slave, applied exquisitely. Her hair, glistening, fell to her shoulders. Her lips were red with slave rouge. "8 gold pieces!" I heard a cry from the crowd. "What of 10? asked the auctioneer. "10!" I heard cry. The auctioneer then threw back the hood of the second girl, Phyllis. She seemed coldly furious. The crowd gasped. The cosmetics enhanced and heightened the drama of her great natural beauty, but with an insolent and deliberate coarseness that was a gauntlet thrown before the blood of men. 20 gold pieces! I heard cry. 25! I heard from another area. Phyllis tossed her head and looked away over the heads of the crowds, nothing but contempt on her face. "What of 30? called the auctioneer. 40! I heard cry. The auctioneer laughed and approached the third girl. Cernus leant over the arm of his chair toward me. "I wonder," he said, "how she will feel when she learns she has been truly sold." "Put a sword in my hand," I said, "and face me." Cernus laughed and turned his attention to the block. As the auctioneer reached for the hood of the third girl, she turned away, and suddenly, though chained by the wrists, darted toward the stairs. The slack in the chain was taken up in her flight, and on the second or third stair down she was spun about and thrown to the steps, half on them and half on the block. The whip-slave who held her chain then hauled her cruelly on her stomach and then on her back to the centre of the block. There the whip-slave stepped on the chain fastened to her slave bracelets, about 6 inches from the bracelets, pinning her wrists to the block. The auctioneer, with his foot on her belly, held her in place. "Shall we have a look at this one?" the auctioneer inquired of the crowd, and there were eager shouts. I was angry. I knew that, in effect, this was a performance, each detail planned expertly, choreographed and rehearsed in the house of Cernus. Cernus chuckled. The crowd shouted eagerly to see the rebellious girl. The auctioneer thrust his hand beneath the hood, and with his fist in her hair, drew her to her knees before the buyers, and then brushed back her hood. The light over the block took the glint of the tiny, finey nose ring in the nose of Elizabeth Cardwell. The crowd gasped. How startling and incredibly beautiful she was! She seemed fine and savage, as vital and dangerous and beautiful as the she-lal. She was a woman who could well have stood amongst the most marvellous of gore. She wore the cosmetics of the slave girl. There was silence. It was a tribute in its way, the honouring by way of awe this magnificent captive female to be sold. The silence was broken by a bid. 100 gold pieces, spoken by a slaver who wore the insignia of Tor some feet from the box of Cernus. 120, said another soberly, matter-of-factly, this man too a professional slaver, he wearing on his left shoulder the sign of Tyrus. The three girls then stood rather together, Elizabeth somewhat forward, the other two a bit behind and flanking her, and then they were led on their chains again about the block. The bids increased to 140 gold pieces, and then the girls were spaced on the block, Elizabeth toward the front and middle, and Virginia and Phyllis on alternate sides. The chains were then removed from their slave bracelets, and the three whip-slaves retired. The auctioneer then, with his key, removed the left slave bracelet from the wrist of each, permitting it to dangle from the right wrist. He then removed the black cloak from Virginia, who stood before us in the brief, sleeveless yellow livery slashed to the belt of a slave girl, and there were cries of approval. He then drew the cloak from Phyllis, who was attired as was Virginia. The crowd cried out with enthusiasm. He then went to Elizabeth and removed her cloak also. The crowd roared with pleasure. Elizabeth had been clad in the briefest leather of a two-chook wagon girl, simple, rough, sleeveless, the short skirt on the left side slit to the belt, so that the saddle of the Kaila mount of the wagon's people would be permitted to her. 200 gold pieces, said the merchant from Kos. 215, called out a high officer in the cavalry of Ar. Again the girls were commanded to walk about the block, and they did so proudly, irritably, as though wishing to express only contempt for what they seemed to regard as the rabble about them. When they had finished, Virginia now stood toward the centre, with Phyllis behind her and to her left, and Elizabeth behind her and to her right. The three whip-slaves then again climbed to the block. By this time the bids had increased to 240. There were some cries of protest, perhaps from the less affluent bidders, that the girls were not of high caste. The auctioneer then motioned to the whip-slave who stood behind Virginia. He drew her left wrist behind her back and snapped it into the open slave bracelet, thus confining both wrists behind her. And then he, pulling at the shoulders of her livery, jerked it down to her waist. This pleased the crowd. There was a bid of 250 then for the lot. The auctioneer then signalled the whip-slaves, and the girls rotated their position, bringing Phyllis to the front of the block. There she, like Virginia, was similarly secured and revealed. The bids then increased to 275 gold pieces, and then the girls rotated again, and this time Elizabeth stood in the centre of the block. "It appears," said the auctioneer, "that this was once a wench of two jooks." The crowd grunted its approval. The Two-Chooks, one of the distant wagon peoples, tend to be, to those of northern Gaul, a people of mystery and intrigue. To those of the southern plains, of course, they tend to be little more than efficient, fierce, and dreaded foes. "Can you guess," asked the auctioneer, "And which of the 3 slaves is Red Silk?" The crowd roared with amusement. "Doubtless," called the auctioneer. "Her two-chuck master used her well." The crowd laughed. At this point, savagely, Elizabeth spat into the face of the auctioneer. The crowd screamed with amusement, but the auctioneer did not seem much pleased. Angrily he motioned back the whip-slave who stood behind the girl, and then he himself threw her hands cruelly behind her back and snapped shut the slave bracelets, thus himself confining her. "You have pleased ignorant herders," he said. "Now we shall see if you can please the man of Ar." So saying, he himself stripped her to the waist before the crowd. Elizabeth was beautiful. The placement of her wrists, of course, like that of the other girls, was no accident. It is done so there be no impediment to the vision of the buyers. I found I wanted to take her in my arms and kiss the slave rouge from her mouth. I suppose my responses were not much different from those of the other men in the crowd. 300 gold pieces," called a rich man of Ar, and the crowd shouted its approval of the bid. 305, said the professional slaver from Tor. 310, announced the slaver, who wore upon his shoulder the sign of Tyrus. The auctioneer looked into the crowd. "Is not Samos," he asked, "first slaver of Port Car, with us this evening?" All eyes turned to one of the boxes near the front of the block. There, slumped in a marble chair, was an indolent figure, yet indolent as is the satisfied beast of prey. About his left shoulder he wore the knotted ropes of Port Car. His garment was simple, dark, closely woven. The hood was thrown back, revealing a broad, wide head, close-cropped white hair. The face was red from windburn and salt. It was wrinkled and lined, cracked like leather. In his ears were 2 small golden rings. In him I sensed power, experience, intelligence, cruelty. I felt in him the presence of the carnivore, at the moment not inclined to hunt or kill. "He is," said the man. This slaver had not yet made a bid. "Surely Samos of Port Car, first slaver of Gor's Tatrix of the sea, noble Port Car, cares to express interest in these unworthy wenches?" There was silence. "Show me the women," said Samos, and the crowd shouted with pleasure. The auctioneer bowed low to Samos, first slaver of Port Car. Almost instantly, by the whip-slaves, the 3 barbarian beauties from the house of Cernus were revealed to the buyers of Ar. The crowd rose to its feet, shouting and stamping, drowning out what bids might have been made. How beautiful were the 3 women, the slaves! When the tumult subsided, the voice of Samos was heard again. "Remove the bracelets." This was done, and the 3 whip-slaves retired, taking with them the bracelets which had confined the lovely commodities that now graced the block of Ar. The crowd shouted and roared and stamped its feet. The girls stood in the light, lifting their head to the crowd, nude and proud on the block, in the wild, shouting and stamping and crying out, and knew themselves beautiful and prized. How marvellous and female they seemed, the 3 slaves, in that moment. There were perhaps dozens of bids that were shouted forth and lost in the acclaim of the crowd. I managed to hear one bid for 400 gold pieces. At last, once again, the crowd subsided. Again the auctioneer looked to the box of Samos, first slaver of Port Car. "Does noble Samos now care to express an interest?" inquired the auctioneer. "Let them perform," said Samos. Again the auctioneer bowed to Samos, and the crowd shouted with delight. "Shall pleasure silks be brought?" inquired the auctioneer. "No," said Samos, and again the crowd roared its pleasure. The musicians took up their instruments, and together the girls danced as 3 slaves, women who would be owned by men. In the crowd, men cried out with pleasure. I even heard gasps from women, perhaps amazingly, startled that their sex was capable of such beauty. The eyes of some of the women shone with ill-concealed admiration and excitement. I could mark the quickness of their breath in their veils. The eyes of others seemed terrified and shrinking. They looked from the block about themselves, suddenly fearing that the men with whom they shared the tears. I heard the tearing of a veil, and heard a girl scream, and turned to see her lips being raped by the kiss of a warrior, and then she was yielding to him. The crowd went wild. Here and there were the cry of a woman in the throng who was seized by those near her. One girl tried to flee and was dragged screaming by the ankle to the foot of a tier, and another woman with her own hands tore away her veil and seized in her hands the head of a man near her, pressing his lips to hers, and in a moment she lay, robes torn, in his arms, weeping and crying out with pleasure. 4 dances the girls danced, while the crowd screamed and roared. And then, at an instant, their dances ended. They stood suddenly motionless, splendid, animal, magnificent, inciting. Then they, breathing deeply, stained with sweat, stepped back on the block, and the auctioneer stepped forward. He didn't even call for a bid. 500 gold pieces, called the rich man of Ar. 520, called the slaver of Tor. 530, cried another man. 535, called the slaver from Tyrus. The auctioneer turned then to the box of Samos, first slaver of Port Car. Does noble Samos, first slaver of Port Car, jewel and mistress of the sea, not care to express an interest in these unworthy wenches? Would they not cheer the heart of a seaman returning from long at sea? There was laughter from the crowd. Would not such be pleased to be served his parga by such as these? Would he not care to see them dance for him? Would the sight of them, eager, lips lifted, in the shadows of a tavern's alcoves, not soothe his weary aching eyes from the sun and salt of gleaming Thassa? The crowd roared with laughter, but Samos did not speak. His eyes revealed no expression. Would they not be a fitting gift for the palace of the very Ubar of Port Car, beautiful jewel and mistress of gleaming Thassa? The crowd was silent. Inwardly I raged, but too I was overcome with horror, for I could not allow even in my imagination that the girls might be sold to one of Port Car. Never has a slave girl escaped from canalled Port Car, protected on one side by the interminable rush-grown delta of the Vosk, and on the other by the broad tides of the Tamber Gulf, and beyond it the vast blue gleaming perilous Thassa. It is said that the chains of a slave girl are heaviest in Port Car. Perhaps nowhere on Gore would the slavery of a girl be so complete, so abject, as in the squalid, malignant Port Car. I wouldn't admit to myself, even in speculation, that such a fate might befall the helpless prizes now upon the block of Ar, years of miserable unrelieved servitude, to live at the beck and call of masters amongst the most cruel of Gore, existing only to give pleasure to one to whom they would always be nothing, only slave. I do not choose now to bid, said Samos, first slaver of Port Car. The auctioneer smiled to himself and bowed low. 540 gold pieces, cried the rich man of Ar, and the crowds cheered its approval of the bid. There was silence. I am offered 540 gold pieces for these hot-blooded barbarian beauties, called the auctioneer. Only 540 gold pieces for this exquisite set of animals in prime condition and superbly trained to tantalize you, to torment you, to drive you wild with pleasure. Do I hear more? Come now, gentle brothers and sisters of Ar. When again will such superb creatures be yours to ensteal for only a paltry sum of golden coin? And there was laughter from the crowd. 545, growled the slaver from Tyrus. The crowd greeted the bid with pleasure, but then it seemed quiet. The auctioneer looked from face to face, and there were no more bids forthcoming. He lifted his hand, palm up, open to the crowd. If he closed his fist, it meant he had accepted the bid. There was silence. Suddenly, to my horror, Elizabeth strode forth to the front of the block. She stood there with her hands on her hips, her head back. "The men of Ar are cheap," she announced. Laughter greeted her, and she too laughed. "Yes, cheap they are," she laughed. She turned around and went to Virginia. "Here," she said tauntingly, "is a slim beauty, lithe and swift, white silk, intelligent, curious for the touch of a man, who for the right man would be the most abject and servile wench a beast could wish. Imagine her, noble men of Ar, chained to your slavering. She alone is worth 500 gold pieces." The crowd roared his approval, and the auctioneer dropped his hand and stepped back, perhaps as surprised as any in the room. "And this wench," said Elizabeth, striding to Phyllis. "What of her?" And Phyllis looked at her startled. "Place your hands behind the back of your head, slave," ordered Elizabeth, "and turn for the buyers of Ar." Startled, Phyllis did precisely as she was told, beautifully. "Oh, masters," taunted Elizabeth, "would you not like this one to wear your collar?" There were shouts of agreement. "But I warn you," said Elizabeth, "she hates men." There was laughter, and Phyllis looked at her in anger. "Do not lower your arms, slave," barked Elizabeth. Phyllis remained as she was, her head back, her back arched. There were tears in her eyes. "She does not think the man lives who can master her," said Elizabeth. "She does not think the man lives who can make her truly a slave girl." There were cries of derision and much laughter. "She is perhaps right," cried Elizabeth. "Surely none of Ar could make such a wench cry with pleasure." There were some angry shouts from the crowd, but mostly roars of laughter. "Would it not be worth 500 gold pieces," asked Elizabeth, "to put your leash on this one and lead her home, to teach her the worth of a man of Ar, if worth they have, and then send her weeping and aching to the kettles of the kitchen until she begs to sleep beneath your slavering?" There was a roar of pleasure and amusement from the crowd. Phyllis's eyes were filled with tears. "Lower your arms, slave," commanded Elizabeth. And Phyllis did so, stepping back, and went to stand beside Virginia. Then Elizabeth herself strode to the front of the block. "And me," she laughed. "Which of you would like to put me in steel?" The crowd roared and stamped, and its men rose to their feet, shouting, pounding their right fists on their left shoulder in Gorean acclaim. "I am, I think," cried Elizabeth, laughing, "a not unworthy wench." And there were shouts of agreement. She pointed her finger at a fine-looking fellow grinning in the audience, a saddle-maker. "Would you not like to own me?" she asked. He slapped his knees with his hands and laughed. "Oh, that I would!" he cried. "You!" cried Elizabeth, pointing to a merchant in rich robes in the 5th tier. "Would you not be pleased to have me submit to you?" "Indeed, wench," he laughed. "Is there a man here," asked Elizabeth, "who would not wish to take me in his arms?" The deafening response, "No!" shouted from thousands of voices, shook the amphitheatre. "Who wants me?" she cried. "I!" came the thousands of responses, making the very walls ring with their pleasure. "But," wailed Elizabeth, "I am only a miserable girl without a master." And she held her wrists together and out to the crowd as though they had been braceleted. "Who will buy me?" she wailed. A thunder of bids was deafening. Elizabeth backed to the other girls and took each by an arm, and together they came to the front of the block. "Who will buy us?" called Elizabeth. 800 gold pieces, came one cry. 850, called another. And then we heard 950 bid, and then, incredibly, 1,000. And then a bid for the astounding sum of 1,400 pieces of gold. The auctioneer signalled to the musicians again, and once more to the shouts of the crowd, while he held open his hand, not yet closing it, taking bids. The girls performed the last moments of R's dance of the newly collared slave girl, who dances her joy at the thought she will soon be in the arms of a strong master. When the dance ended, the 3 girls, slaves, knelt in the position of submission, back on their heels, arms extended, heads lowered, wrists crossed as though for binding. Elizabeth knelt facing the crowd, and perpendicular to her on her left and right knelt Virginia and Phyllis, a vulnerable, submitted flower of slave girls. The auctioneer waited for some minutes for the acclaim of the crowd to subside. The last bid he had received had been an astounding 1,500 pieces of gold. To my knowledge, never in the Caerleon had a set of 3 gifts brought such a price. The investment of Cairns had been, it seemed, a good one. The auctioneer called out to the crowd, now silent, "I will close my fist." "Do not close your fist," said Samos, first slaver of Port Car. Deferentially the auctioneer regarded the slaver of squalid, malignant Port Car, a mistress and scourge of gleaming Thassa. "Does Samos, first slaver of Port Car, mistress and jewel of gleaming Thassa, now care to express interest?" "He does," said Samos dispassionately. "What is the Caerleon bid?" inquired the auctioneer. "It is bid," said the man, "by Samos, first slaver of Port Car, for the wenches now on the block, 3,000 pieces of gold." There was an audible gasp throughout the audience in the swirling amphitheatre. The auctioneer stepped back astonished. Even the girls lifted their heads, startled, breaking the discipline of the submitted flower. And then, smiling, Elizabeth lowered her head again, and so too did Virginia and Phyllis. I felt sick. Doubtless Elizabeth thought Samos the agent of priest-kings, sent to purchase them and carry them to safety and freedom. Cairns was chuckling. The fist of the auctioneer closed, as though grasping a handful of golden coins. "The women are sold," he cried, and the crowd shouted its pleasure and delight. The girls were now on their feet, and whip-slaves were braceleting their wrists before their bodies, and attaching the lead chains to their bracelets, preparing to conduct the purchased merchandise from the block. "More barbarians!" cried the crowd. "Let us see more barbarians!" "You shall," cried the auctioneer, "you shall. We have sets of barbarians to present for your consideration and pleasure. Do not be disappointed. There are more. There are many more barbarians to be sold, beautiful and splendid lots, superbly trained." The crowd trembled with excitement. Elizabeth and the 2 other girls had now been secured, braceleted, and on their leashes. The ordeal of the sale over, Virginia and Phyllis were weeping. Elizabeth, by remarkable contrast, seemed exceedingly well pleased. When they had turned and were being led from the block by the whip slaves who held their leashes, Kernis spoke to two of the guards behind me. "Throw the fool on his feet. Let her see him." I struggled, but I could not resist the men who hauled me to my feet. "Behold, an enemy of Kernis!" cried Philemon to the block. The girls turned, and then Elizabeth, peering out into the crowd for the first time, saw me in the rag of a slave, my wrists bound behind my back in steel, the helpless captive of Kernis, slaver Oba Abar. Her eyes were wide. She stood as though stunned. She put her braceleted hands before her mouth. She shook her head disbelievingly, and then by the chain and bracelet she was rudely turned about. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes wide with horror, and then, fighting the chain and bracelets, she was dragged stumbling down the steps. It was then she understood herself sold. She cried out wildly, helplessly, a long screaming wail of misery and understanding. I heard the sound of a slave whip below the block, the hysterical, wild sobbing and screaming of a slave girl. And then, as she was dragged away, the sound of the whip and of her cries grew more distant, and I could hear them no more. "And before she is delivered to Samos," Kernis was saying, "I think I will have her return to the house and use her. She intrigued me this evening. Since she is red silk, Samos will not object." I said nothing. "Take him away," said Kernis. In a moment, manacled, a guard holding each arm, I was being conducted from the amphitheatre. The lights of the amphitheatre briefly went out and then flashed on again. I heard the crowd cry out. I heard the auctioneer making his call for the first bid. I knew that behind me, on the block, there would be a new lot for sale, more to please the buyers of Ar.